Story 1. The thing I saw before I fully woke up. I used to think sleeping was the one time nobody could really hurt you. You locked the door, turned off the lights, and disappeared for a few hours. Whatever problems existed during the day stayed outside the bedroom until morning. That was how I always thought about it, at least until the night I opened my eyes and saw someone standing at the foot of my bed. At first, I honestly thought I was still dreaming. The room was dark except for a weak orange glow leaking through the blinds from the parking lot outside my apartment. I could barely make out details, but I could tell there was a shape there. Tall, completely still, facing me. I remember staring at it without moving. My body felt heavy, like I'd woken up too fast and my brain had not caught up yet. The figure did not speak. It did not move closer. It just stood there quietly, almost blending into the darkness near my dresser. Then headlights passed outside, and for a second, the room brightened enough for me to realize something that still bothers me now. The shape was not near the dresser. It was standing directly beside the end of my bed. I jerked upright so fast that my blanket slid onto the floor. The room was empty. I turned on the lamp beside me immediately, half expecting to see somebody crouching in the corner or hiding behind the bedroom door, but there was nothing there. My apartment was silent except for the small hum of the air conditioner in the window. I checked every room anyway. The bathroom was empty. The kitchen was empty. The front door was still locked from the inside. I barely slept the rest of that night. Every tiny sound kept pulling my attention toward the bedroom doorway. Pipes clicking inside the walls sounded like footsteps. Cars outside sounded too close. By morning, I had convinced myself it was probably some kind of sleep paralysis episode. I had heard people describe things like that before, waking up and seeing shapes in the room, your mind filling in shadows before you fully wake up. The problem was that I had never experienced anything remotely like that before. I lived alone in a small apartment above a laundromat on the edge of town. It was not a bad place, just old. The floors creaked constantly, and the pipes rattled whenever someone downstairs used hot water. Still, I liked living there because it was quiet most nights. At least it used to feel quiet. After that night, I started noticing little things that felt slightly off. Nothing dramatic, just small details that were easy to dismiss individually, but harder to ignore altogether. One morning, I found my bedroom door open, even though I always slept with it closed. Another time, my phone was charging on the opposite side of the bed from where I remembered leaving it. Then, there was the closet light. I specifically remember turning it off before going to sleep because the bulb inside made a faint buzzing sound that annoyed me at night. But 2 days after seeing that figure, I woke up around 3 in the morning and saw a thin strip of yellow light spilling across the carpet from inside the closet. The door was cracked open. I stayed completely still under the blanket for almost a minute before finally getting up to close it. What scared me was not the light itself. It was the fact that the closet smelled faintly like cold air and rain, as if someone had opened a window somewhere inside my apartment while I was asleep. I checked every window before going back to bed. They were all locked, including the one beside the fire escape outside. I remember standing there with my hand on the curtain, looking down into the empty parking lot below, trying to calm myself down. That was when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Wet footprints led across the concrete outside near the building entrance, and they stopped directly beneath my apartment window that night. Small changes in the apartment. I stood at the window for a long time that night, staring down at the wet pavement below the building. The footprints were faint, almost washed away by the rain, but I could still make out the shape of them beneath the orange parking lot lights. They ended directly below my fire escape and nowhere else. No prints leading away. No sign of where the person had gone. I remember trying to come up with reasonable explanations because that felt easier than admitting how uncomfortable I was becoming. Maybe somebody had been standing there smoking during the rain. Maybe I was only noticing things because of what I thought I saw beside my bed. Once your brain gets stuck on something, it starts connecting details that normally would not matter. That was what I kept telling myself. The next morning, I went to work exhausted. I spent most of the day replaying the image of that dark shape in my room and trying to convince myself it had not been real. By the time I got home that evening, I felt calmer. The apartment looked normal again. Quiet, safe. But then I noticed my bedroom door. I always kept it closed before leaving for work. Not all the way shut, but close enough that my cat could not get inside and sleep on the bed. except I did not own a cat anymore. Mine had died the year before, and I had never broken the habit of keeping the door mostly closed. That evening, the door was open almost halfway. I stood there in the hallway, staring at it longer than I should have. Part of me already knew I was overreacting, but another part kept waiting for something to move inside the room. Eventually, I walked in and checked the apartment again. Closets, bathroom, shower curtain. Under the bed, nothing. The strange part was that nothing looked disturbed. My laptop was still on the desk. My wallet was still in the kitchen drawer where I always left it. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere. I started wondering if maybe I was the problem. I had been under a lot of stress at work around that time. Long shifts, poor sleep, too much coffee. I even looked up symptoms of sleepwalking one night because I wanted an explanation that made sense. People apparently did all kinds of things while asleep and forgot them completely afterward. Moving objects around, opening doors, turning on lights. That explanation worked for a while, until the phone incident. I woke up sometime before sunrise after hearing a notification vibrate beside me. My phone was lying on the mattress near my shoulder. At first, I did not think much of it. Then I realized I never slept with my phone in bed. I always left it charging on the nightstand across the room because the light from the screen bothered me at night. I sat there staring at it while the room stayed completely silent around me. The charging cable was still plugged into the wall, meaning somebody had unplugged the phone, or I had. I checked the screen immediately, expecting to see texts or missed calls that might explain why I brought it into bed, but there was nothing except the lock screen and the time. 4:13 a.m., I barely slept after that. Over the next week, the apartment started feeling less familiar. It's not dangerous exactly, just wrong in small ways I could never fully prove. Sometimes I would come home and catch a faint smell of cold air in the bedroom, like someone had opened a window minutes earlier. Other times, objects looked slightly repositioned. A chair angled differently, the bathroom rug crooked against the floor tiles. Once, I found the closet light on again. That bothered me more than it should have. I stood in the doorway, staring into the closet for nearly a minute before turning the light off. Everything inside looked normal. Hanging jackets, shoe rack, storage boxes. But I could not shake the feeling that somebody had been standing there recently. A few nights later, I woke up around 2 in the morning with the strange feeling that I was not alone in the apartment. Not because of a sound. Because of the silence, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath with me. I stayed awake until sunrise, listening carefully for footsteps that never quite came close enough. The camera that proved I wasn't alone the next morning, I stopped at an electronics store before work and bought the cheapest indoor security camera they had. I remember feeling embarrassed carrying it to the register because some part of me still believed I was overreacting. The cashier even joked that people only bought those after watching too many crime documentaries online. I laughed with him because it felt easier than explaining the truth. I set the camera on my dresser that evening, facing the bedroom door. It was small, white, and cheap-looking, the kind of thing people used to check on pets while they were away from home. I told myself the footage would probably prove I was sleepwalking or leaving doors open without remembering. Honestly, that was what I wanted it to prove. The first night, nothing happened. I checked the recording before work the next morning and watched 8 hours of myself, sleeping in grainy black and white footage. The only movement came from me rolling over occasionally and headlights sliding through the blinds from the parking lot outside. The second night was exactly the same. By that point, I actually started feeling relieved. Watching those recordings made the apartment feel normal again. There were no strangers, no shadows standing near my bed, no doors opening in the middle of the night. I almost stopped using the camera after that. Then came the third night. I fell asleep sometime after midnight while watching videos on my laptop. I remember waking briefly around 2 in the morning because the pipes inside the wall made one of their usual knocking sounds. I checked my phone, saw the time, then rolled over and went back to sleep immediately. The next afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table with coffee and opened the camera app mostly out of habit. At first, the footage looked completely normal. The timestamp in the corner moved quietly through the night while I slept facing the wall. Nothing changed for nearly 2 hours. Then, at exactly 2:17 a.m., the bedroom door moved. Not suddenly. Slowly. The handle turned first, almost carefully, like somebody was trying not to make noise. Then the door opened a few inches and stopped. I remember leaning closer to my phone screen because part of my brain still expected a normal explanation. Maybe airflow from the window. Maybe the door had not latched correctly. Then a person stepped into the doorway. Only partially at first. I could see one shoulder and part of their head standing in the darkness beyond my room. They did not rush inside or move aggressively. They just stood there watching me sleep. The footage had no sound, but I could almost feel the silence inside the room while I watched it. What disturbed me most was how comfortable the person looked. There was no hesitation in the way they opened the door. No nervous movements. Whoever it was moved through the apartment like somebody who had done it before. They leaned slightly against the frame for several seconds, completely relaxed, while staring directly toward the bed. Toward me. I paused the footage and just sat there staring at the screen. My hands actually started shaking a little, which almost never happens to me. I remember replaying those few seconds over and over because my brain refused to process what I was seeing. The person's face stayed hidden in darkness the entire time. But something about the way they stood there felt strangely familiar. Not familiar like someone I knew. Familiar like someone who knew the apartment. After almost a full minute, the figure slowly pulled back out of sight. The bedroom door remained open about halfway afterward. The rest of the footage showed nothing else entering the room for the next several hours. Immediately checked the locks on my apartment after watching it. The front door was locked. The windows were locked. Nothing was missing. That somehow made it worse. If somebody wanted to rob me, at least that would have made sense. But this person had entered my apartment in the middle of the night and done nothing except stand there watching me sleep. I barely made it through work that evening. Every sound around me felt sharper than usual. Every stranger suddenly seemed suspicious. By the time I got home, I had already decided I was calling the police. I walked through the apartment slowly after that, checking corners I normally ignored behind the shower curtain. Inside the narrow space beside the refrigerator. Even inside the kitchen cabinets, which made me feel ridiculous the entire time. I kept expecting to find some obvious sign that would explain everything, but the apartment looked untouched. The only thing that stood out was the air in the bedroom. It smelled faintly cold again, like rain drifting through a window, even though every window in the apartment was locked from the inside. But when I opened my apartment door, something stopped me cold. My bedroom door was already open, and I specifically remembered closing it before leaving that morning. The part the camera didn't record, I did not sleep much that night after seeing the bedroom door open again. I pushed a chair beneath the front door handle, checked the locks 3 separate times, left every light in the apartment on until sunrise, around 4 in the morning. I finally convinced myself to review the camera footage again because I needed to know whether the person had come back. At first, everything looked normal. The timestamp moved steadily across the screen while I slept facing the wall. Around 1:48 a.m., the bedroom door slowly opened just like before. The same figure appeared partially in the doorway again, standing completely still. Even after watching it a second time, I still could not explain why the movements felt so familiar. The person leaned against the frame casually, almost comfortably, like they belonged there. Then the footage froze. Not for a second. For almost 7 full minutes. The screen turned gray and pixelated while the timestamp skipped forward. When the video finally returned, the bedroom door was closed again. I was still asleep in the bed. At first I thought nothing had changed. Then I noticed something resting on the blanket beside me near my arm. Single key. I remember staring at the screen for several seconds before rewinding the footage again. The key was not there before the camera froze. It only appeared after the recording returned. My stomach dropped so hard it actually hurt. Whoever entered my apartment had walked close enough to place something directly beside me while I slept. The thought of that bothered me more than the footage itself. I tried remembering whether I had woken up at any point during the night, but my memory was completely blank. I grabbed the actual key from the bed immediately after watching the recording. It looked old and scratched, with faded blue paint near the top. No keychain, no label. Just a single metal key sitting on my blanket like somebody had left me a message. I called the police later that afternoon. An officer came by, watched part of the footage, and checked the apartment, but there was not much they could actually do. The video quality was terrible. The person's face was impossible to identify. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the apartment, and nothing had been stolen. That last part kept coming up repeatedly. Are you sure nothing's missing? Every time they asked, I felt more unsettled because they were right. Whoever this person was, they had opportunities to take almost anything inside my apartment. My laptop sat exposed on the desk every night. My wallet stayed in the kitchen drawer. None of it had been touched. The officer eventually suggested somebody connected to the building might have access to older keys. Previous tenants, maintenance workers, contractors. He told me to change the locks if management allowed it and contact them immediately about the situation. I moved out 3 days later instead. I barely packed carefully, just wanted to leave the apartment as fast as possible. Even during the daytime, the bedroom no longer felt normal to me. Every corner of that room carried the feeling that somebody had been standing there quietly while I slept. For weeks afterward, I kept waking up suddenly during the night, expecting to see another shape near the bed. Sometimes I even checked my apartment doors multiple times before sleeping without realizing it. The whole experience stayed with me longer than I expected. About 2 months later, I received a call from the building manager. At first, I thought it was about my security deposit. Instead, he asked whether the police had ever figured out who entered my apartment. I told him no. There was a long silence before he explained that one of the older maintenance employees had recently been fired after they discovered something strange. Apparently, a master key assigned to him had been missing for several months without anyone reporting it officially. Then he said something I still think about sometimes. The missing key had old blue paint near the top. It looked like the one from my bed. Story 2: The guest room window a few years after the apartment incident. I started telling myself I had mostly moved on from it. I still locked my bedroom door every night and double-checked windows more often than normal, but the constant anxiety eventually faded into something quieter. More like a habit than fear. Then I visited my old college friend Marcus, and everything came back. Marcus had moved to a small rural town about 4 hours away from the city. We had stayed in touch online over the years, but we had not actually seen each other in person since college. When he invited me to stay for a weekend barbecue at his place, I agreed mostly because I needed to get out of town for a while. The drive there felt peaceful at first. The farther I got from the city, the emptier the roads became. Gas stations grew farther apart. Streetlights disappeared almost completely after sunset. By the time I reached Marcus's neighborhood, it barely felt like a neighborhood at all. The houses sat far apart from each other with long stretches of trees between them. Marcus lived in a single-story house near the edge of town. Behind the backyard was a wide line of woods that stretched farther than I could see in the dark. I remember hearing insects outside when I parked, but otherwise the place was completely silent. Marcus greeted me normally enough, spent most of the evening grilling food, drinking beer, and catching up about old classmates we had not thought about in years. Nothing felt strange at first. If anything, the calmness of the place actually relaxed me. Still, I noticed small things. Marcus kept checking the backyard through the kitchen window while we talked. Not nervously exactly, just automatically, like somebody glancing at a clock. At one point, I joked about how quiet the area felt compared to the city. And he laughed before saying, "Yeah, this place gets way too quiet at night." The way he said it stuck with me afterward. Not because of the words themselves, but because he stopped smiling almost immediately after saying them. Later that night, he showed me the guest room where I would be sleeping. Sat at the end of a narrow hallway facing the backyard. The room itself looked normal enough. A small bed, a wooden dresser, a lamp beside the window. But the curtains immediately caught my attention. They were already pulled tightly shut before I even entered the room. It's not casually closed either. The fabric had been pinned together so carefully that almost no light could pass through from outside. I remember joking, "What are you hiding out there?" Marcus laughed, but it sounded forced this time. "Trust me," he said, "you'll sleep better if you leave them closed." That answer should not have bothered me as much as it did. But something about the tone made the room suddenly feel smaller. After he went to bed, I stayed awake scrolling through my phone for a while. The silence inside the house felt unusually deep. No distant traffic, no neighbors outside, not even dogs barking anywhere nearby. Just occasional wind moving softly through the trees behind the house. Around midnight, I finally turned off the lamp and tried to sleep. At some point during the night, I woke up without knowing why. The room was pitch black, except for a faint glow leaking around the edges of the curtains. For a few seconds, I just lay there listening to the silence. Then I heard it. A soft tapping sound, very light. 3 slow taps against the window beside the bed. I froze immediately. At first, I assumed it was probably a tree branch brushing the glass from outside. But after a few seconds, the tapping came again. 3 more taps. Controlled, deliberate. I slowly turned my head toward the curtains, while the room stayed completely silent around me. And then, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The curtains were no longer fully closed. A narrow gap had opened between them. Someone outside didn't want to be seen. I stared at the gap in the curtains for several seconds without moving. It was only an inch or 2 wide, but I knew for a fact they had been completely shut before I went to sleep. Remembered Marcus pulling them tightly together himself before leaving the room earlier that night. Now there was just enough space between them for me to see a thin slice of the backyard outside. The tapping came again. 3 slow taps against the glass. I felt that strange heaviness people talk about when fear hits before your brain fully understands why. My body already knew something was wrong, even while my mind kept searching for normal explanations. Tree branch. Loose gravel. An animal. Anything except what I was starting to imagine. I stayed completely still under the blanket while staring toward the window. The gap between the curtains looked darker than the rest of the room somehow. Like the night outside carried a different kind of darkness than normal. Another tap. This time, I noticed something that immediately ruled out the branch idea. The sound was too precise. There was a pause between each set, almost like whoever made it was waiting for a reaction inside the room. I slowly reached for my phone on the nightstand without taking my eyes off the window. The screen lit up softly when I picked it up. 2:41 a.m. for some reason. Seeing the exact time made everything feel more real. The tapping stopped completely after that. I remember holding my breath while listening carefully for movement outside. But the backyard had gone silent again. Eventually, I convinced myself to get out of bed and close the curtains properly. Even now, I still do not know why I thought that was a good idea. Maybe part of me wanted proof that nothing was there. The floor creaked softly beneath my feet as I crossed the room. I moved slowly, trying not to make noise, though I could not explain who I was trying to avoid alerting. When I reached the window, I hesitated before touching the curtain fabric. Then I looked through the gap. At first I saw nothing except darkness and the faint outline of trees farther back near the woods. Then something moved, low to the ground directly beneath the window. I actually flinched backward before realizing what I was looking at. There was a person crouched outside. Not standing, crouched. Their shape blended so well into the darkness that I almost missed it completely. I could only make out pale skin and part of a shoulder near the bottom corner of the window. Whoever it was had been positioned low enough that they could not easily be seen from inside, unless someone walked directly to the glass. And the worst part was realizing they were facing upward, toward me. I stepped back immediately without thinking, and the movement must have caught their attention because the shape outside shifted slightly. Then it started rising slowly. I cannot explain how disturbing that moment felt. The person outside did not stand up naturally. It moved carefully, almost cautiously, like somebody trying not to scare an animal. Their heads slowly lifted higher into view, while the rest of the backyard stayed completely silent around them. I caught a glimpse of part of a face, pale skin, dark eyes, no expression at all. The figure stopped rising when their eyes reached the level of the window gap. Then they just stared inside. I stumbled backward, hard enough to hit the dresser behind me. The noise finally snapped me out of whatever frozen state I had fallen into. I grabbed my phone and hurried toward the bedroom door, nearly slipping on the hardwood floor while fumbling for the handle. The hallway outside felt strangely darker than before. I could hear my own breathing echoing softly through the house as I rushed toward Marcus's room. I knocked hard enough to hurt my hand and whispered his name at first, then louder when he did not answer immediately. By the time he opened the door, I already knew something about his reaction was wrong. He looked tired, not confused, not alarmed, just tired. I started explaining what I saw outside the guest room window, speaking too fast and stumbling over words, but Marcus barely interrupted me. He simply looked past me, toward the dark hallway leading back to the guest room. Then he sighed quietly. "You saw somebody out there?" he asked. I nodded immediately. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then, In a calm voice that frightened me more than panic would have, he said, "Don't sleep in that room again tonight." The friend's reaction was worse. Marcus stepped into the hallway beside me and closed his bedroom door behind him. I kept waiting for him to grab a flashlight or look outside, but he did neither. He just stood there listening toward the back of the house with an expression I could not fully read. "You actually saw somebody?" he asked again. "Yeah," I whispered. They were crouched outside the window. Marcus rubbed his face slowly like somebody trying to wake himself up. Then he glanced toward the guest room hallway before speaking again. "Okay," he said quietly. "Just sleep in the living room tonight." That was it. To panic, no questions about what the person looked like, no suggestion to call the police. I stared at him, waiting for more, but Marcus simply walked toward the living room and grabbed a blanket from the couch. "You're not even going to check outside?" I asked. He stopped moving for a moment before answering. No. The way he said it made my stomach tighten immediately. Not nervous, certain. I remember standing there under the dim kitchen light, realizing his reaction scared me more than the person outside the window. If somebody had been crouching outside my house in the middle of the night, I would have checked instantly, even if it was dangerous. Us. But Marcus acted like looking outside was the one thing he absolutely did not want to do. "Has this happened before?" I asked. He shook his head too quickly. "Just get some sleep," he muttered. I did not argue after that. Partly because I was exhausted, but mostly because the entire atmosphere inside the house had changed. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt tense, like the house itself was listening. I lay awake on the couch for hours, staring toward the dark hallway leading to the guest room. Every small sound made me look up. Wind moving through trees outside, pipes shifting inside the walls. Once, sometime close to sunrise, I thought I heard footsteps crossing slowly through the backyard gravel behind the house. Marcus never came out of his room again that night. By morning, the fear had dulled enough for me to start questioning myself again. Daylight makes things feel less threatening somehow. I convinced myself there was probably a normal explanation for whatever I saw outside the window. That feeling disappeared the second I stepped into the backyard. The grass behind the guest room was still wet from overnight dew, and footprints led directly beneath the window. Not animal tracks. Bare human footprints. They stopped inches from the wall of the house. I crouched beside them, while cold air moved through the trees behind the yard. Whoever made the prints had been standing there for a while too. The ground beneath the window looked flattened, like somebody had stayed in the same spot watching the room for several minutes. Then I noticed the scratches. Long, thin marks carved into the outside window frame beside the glass. Not random damage either. They were clustered close together near the bottom corner, exactly where the figure's hand would have rested while crouching outside. Marcus came outside while I was staring at them. Second he saw where I was looking, his expression changed immediately. "What is that?" I asked. He looked away toward the woods instead of answering. "Probably from branches," he said. "There aren't any branches near the window." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Marcus quietly said something that still bothers me now. "That's why I keep the curtains closed." Story 3. The motel door chain. The third story happened during a long drive through western Kansas a couple years later. I had been on the road nearly 11 hours already, trying to make it to Colorado before stopping for the night. But somewhere around midnight I realized I was too exhausted to keep driving safely. The highway was almost empty by then. Every few miles I would pass an isolated gas station or dark roadside diner with half the lights turned off. Eventually I saw a faded motel sign glowing beside the road and decided I would only stay long enough to sleep for a few hours before leaving again at sunrise. The motel looked older than it probably appeared online. Half the parking lot lights flickered weakly, and several rooms looked abandoned completely. I remember noticing curtains missing from some windows and old air conditioning units hanging crooked from the walls. The place itself was not terrifying exactly, just tired. Inside the office, a small television played quietly behind the counter, while an older man checked me in without saying much. He barely looked up during the entire conversation. When he handed me the room key, he hesitated for a second before saying, "Door sticks sometimes. You gotta pull it hard." That was the only unusual thing about the interaction. My room sat near the far end of the building, facing the parking lot. The air smelled faintly like dust and old carpet when I stepped inside, but otherwise everything looked normal enough for a cheap roadside motel. Small bed. Lamp beside the wall. television bolted to a dresser, bathroom light buzzing softly overhead. I locked the door behind me immediately out of habit and tossed my bag near the chair beside the window. At first, I honestly felt relieved just to stop driving. My eyes burned from staring at the highway for hours, and I noticed the chain lock. The metal bracket attached to the wall looked slightly bent outward, like somebody had forced pressure against it repeatedly over time. Not broken exactly, just warped enough that I stopped touching it for a second. I remember testing the chain twice before finally convincing myself it still worked. After that, I checked the peephole. Something about it looked scratched from the outside. Tiny marks surrounded the metal rim as if someone had used tools around it before. Again, nothing dramatic enough to justify panic. Just another small detail that felt slightly wrong. That was the pattern with places like this. Nothing obvious. Only tiny things your brain keeps returning to afterward. I tried distracting myself by turning on the television while getting ready for bed. Around 1 in the morning, I finally shut everything off except the bathroom light, leaving the door cracked open slightly so the room would not feel completely dark. That was when I noticed the mirror. It hung on the wall opposite the bed near the dresser, angled just enough that someone standing near the motel door could see the entire mattress reflected inside it. I actually got up to look at it more closely because the angle felt intentional somehow. The mirror itself was mounted crooked, not dramatically, just enough that the bed became the center of the reflection. I remember adjusting it slightly before climbing into bed. A few minutes later, I glanced toward the dresser again. The mirror had shifted back. At least I thought it had. I stared at it for several seconds, trying to decide whether I was imagining things from exhaustion. Eventually, I told myself I was being paranoid again. Long drive? Lack of sleep? Strange motel. My brain was probably connecting meaningless details together the same way it always did after dark. Still, before turning off the lamp beside the bed, I checked the chain lock one more time. And this time I noticed faint scratches on the inside of the door too. The breathing on the other side, I woke up suddenly sometime later without knowing why. For the first few seconds, I just lay there staring at the faint bathroom light spilling across the motel floor. My body still felt heavy with sleep, but something inside the room immediately felt wrong. Then I heard it, breathing, very faint, near the door. I stayed completely still under the blanket while listening carefully. At first, I wondered if the sound might be coming from outside through the air conditioner unit, but after a few seconds I realized it was too close. Somebody was standing directly outside my room, not moving, just breathing softly on the other side of the door. The chain lock suddenly felt a lot less secure. I slowly reached for my phone beside the pillow without making noise. The screen lit up dimly in my hand. 3:08 a.m., the breathing continued, slow, patient. I remember holding my own breath for a second, just to make sure I was hearing it correctly. The motel room had gone completely silent, except for the faint hum of the bathroom light and that quiet breathing outside. What frightened me most was the stillness. Whoever stood outside my room was not trying to get in. They were just standing there, listening. I stared toward the door while my mind kept cycling through explanations. That made less and less sense the longer the silence continued. Maybe somebody had the wrong room. Maybe another guest was drunk. Maybe they were about to knock. But they never knocked. Several minutes passed like that, and I heard something shift softly near the peephole. Not footsteps, but more like somebody leaning closer toward the door itself. And then a voice whispered my room number 26. Very quietly, almost thoughtfully. The voice did not sound confused either. It sounded like confirmation. Like the person outside already knew exactly which room they wanted. Every hair on my arm stood up instantly. I remember staring at the bent chain lock while trying to decide what normal people were supposed to do in situations like that. Part of me wanted to yell through the door or threaten to call the police. But something about the silence outside made me afraid to let the person know I was awake. So instead, I grabbed the motel phone beside the bed and called the front desk. The line rang and rang. Nobody answered. I hung up and immediately dialed again while keeping my eyes fixed on the door. Still nothing. The breathing outside had stopped by then, which somehow felt even worse. I could not tell whether the person had walked away or was simply standing there silently. I muted my phone and considered calling the police directly, but I hesitated because I knew how insane the story would sound. Someone breathing outside a motel room at 3 in the morning was unsettling. but not exactly an emergency anyone could prove. Then the door chain rattled softly, just once, very lightly. I froze completely. The sound was so subtle that another person might have missed it entirely, but from the bed I heard the metal pull tight against the frame for half a second before settling again. Whoever stood outside had tested the door. I slid quietly out of bed and back toward the bathroom while keeping the motel phone in my hand. The mirror near the dresser reflected part of the room behind me, including the door. That was when I noticed something else. A shadow blocked the light beneath the door. Someone was still there, completely motionless. I stayed inside the bathroom for what felt like nearly an hour, sitting on the edge of the tub with every light turned off except the buzzing fixture above the sink. The motel room outside remained silent the entire time. No footsteps, no knocking, nothing. Eventually, sometime close to sunrise, I realized I could no longer see the shadow beneath the door. But I still did not leave the bathroom immediately, because deep down, I was not completely sure the person outside had actually gone away. What the morning clerk said, by the time sunlight started leaking through the motel curtains, I had convinced myself the person outside the door was gone. Even then, I stayed inside the bathroom another 20 minutes listening carefully for movement before finally stepping back into the room. Everything looked normal again. The shadow beneath the door had disappeared. The chain lock still hung loosely against the frame. The mirror across from the bed reflected the same quiet motel room from the night before, except now the weak morning light made everything look smaller and less threatening. That almost made me feel stupid, almost. I packed my bag quickly without turning on the television or sitting down again. The entire room felt contaminated somehow, like the air itself had changed overnight. Before leaving, I checked the peephole one last time from inside the room. In daylight, the scratches around it looked even worse than they had the night before. Tiny marks circled the metal rim in uneven patterns, as though somebody had repeatedly pried at it with something sharp. Outside, the parking lot was nearly empty. My car sat exactly where I left it, covered in a thin layer of dust from the highway. No people, no movement, just distant traffic humming beyond the road. I carried my bag to the office and found the same older clerk behind the counter watching television again. He looked surprised to see me standing there so early. "Everything all right?" he asked. I hesitated before answering because suddenly the story sounded ridiculous in my own head. Somebody breathing outside a motel room at 3 in the morning was terrifying while it happened, but impossible to explain afterward without sounding paranoid. "I think somebody was outside my room last night," I finally said. The clerk frowned slightly. "What room?" 26. For a second, something flickered across his face. Not shock exactly. Recognition. But it disappeared almost immediately. "Nobody else was staying near you," he said quickly. "Place was mostly empty last night." I nodded slowly, though his answer somehow made me feel worse instead of better. "Well, somebody tried my door," I said. And the front desk phone just kept ringing. The clerk glanced toward the office phone beside him before shrugging. "Probably asleep in the back," he muttered. There was an awkward silence after that while he typed something into the computer. I remember thinking the conversation was over until he casually added, "Kinda strange somebody requested that room earlier too." I looked up immediately. "What do you mean requested it?" The clerk stopped typing. For a second he genuinely looked annoyed with himself. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Just some guy asking questions earlier yesterday." "What kind of questions?" I hesitated long enough to make my stomach tighten again. "Asked whether room 26 faced the parking lot," he admitted quietly. The office suddenly felt much colder. "Who asked that?" The clerk shook his head immediately. "Didn't rent anything, just left afterward." I remember staring at him, waiting for more explanation, but he avoided eye contact completely after that. The television behind the counter kept playing softly while neither of us spoke. A minute later, I walked out without saying anything else. The entire drive away from the motel felt wrong. Every time another car stayed behind me too long on the highway, I checked the mirror repeatedly. I kept replaying the whisper outside my door over and over in my head. 26 not confused, not accidental like confirmation. About 2 hours later, I stopped for gas and finally checked my phone properly for the first time since leaving the motel. I had several missed notifications from overnight that I ignored immediately. Then I opened my photo gallery to look for an old receipt screenshot. That was when I noticed a new image saved at 3:11 a.m. I do not remember taking a picture. At first I assumed it had happened accidentally while I held the phone in the bathroom during the night. But when I opened the image, my entire body went cold. The photo showed the motel bed. Not from the bathroom, from inside the room near the door. The image was dark and blurry, but I could still make out my own body asleep beneath the blanket. And near the bottom corner of the picture, barely visible beside the frame, was part of someone's hand. The fingernails looked dirty, like the person had been digging through soil or gravel outside recently. Final reflection. I still check the corners. I think the reason these experiences stayed with me for so long is because none of them ended the way horror stories usually do. Nobody attacked me. Nobody chased me. There was never some dramatic moment where I finally saw everything clearly and escaped at the last second. Instead, the fear came from realizing how close everything felt without ever fully revealing itself. That person in my apartment had time to stand beside my bed while I slept, the figure outside. Marcus's guest room knew exactly where to crouch, so they would stay hidden unless someone looked carefully through the curtains. And whoever stood outside my motel room at 3 in the morning seemed completely comfortable waiting silently in the dark, without saying a word. That is the part that still bothers me, the patience. Normal people make noise eventually. They panic, they rush, they hesitate. But every person connected to these stories moved calmly, like they had done those things before. Sometimes, I still think about the maintenance key sitting on my blanket beside me while the camera footage skipped forward 7 missing minutes. Other nights I think about those footprints outside Marcus's guest room and the scratches already carved into the window frame before I ever arrived. But the motel story unsettles me the most, because I still have that photo. I never deleted it. Every once in a while, usually late at night, I open it again and zoom into the dark corner near the door, hoping I will notice something new that explains what happened. But the image never becomes clearer, only gets stranger the longer I stare at it. The hand in the corner looks wrong somehow. Not unnatural, just relaxed. Like the person holding the phone was completely comfortable, standing there beside my bed while I slept. I still sleep with my bedroom door locked now, still check windows before bed without thinking about it. Sometimes I even wake up during the night and stare into the corners of the room for several seconds before fully realizing where I am. Most mornings I laugh at myself afterward, but every now and then I wake up with the overwhelming feeling that somebody was standing near the bed only seconds earlier. Like I opened my eyes just a little too late, and whoever was there had already stepped quietly back into the dark.